Peter first came here, first came here in 2007, actually as an RU student who worked with me out of Micah Creek, and after he showed up, I promptly disappeared for about 3 weeks. And Zion had a great time, produced actually enough data to get a great paper, and also a whole bunch of selfies that I found on the hard drive of the computer, which I meant to actually have a little pre-dissertation slideshow, but I didn't have time to put it together. But I'll share those separately if anybody's interested. Anyway, it was selfies before selfie was a word.
I hope those would show up somewhere at one day.
I think I sent some to your parents, actually.
Yeah, I saw one that came through.
Anyway, and then Zion graduated from Colorado College in, I think, 2009. And I can't actually remember how long you've been here. I want to say he came in 2011?
2010.
2010. Okay, great. And so Zion has joined in with the Ecosystem Resilience IGRT project. And I could name all the different things that Zion's been doing, but it would take probably most of the session here. So, but I do want to just briefly say that he's done an admirable job, a spectacular job balancing combination of research, teaching, and service through a number of publications, a number of courses taught both here at the University of Idaho as well as at Quest College or University up in Squamish, British Columbia, and at Colorado College. And then has done just an incredible number of outreach presentations that I think are around 80 or so, through everything from the co-op to the Boise Public Library to agencies and everything in between. So anyway, so again, I want to say congratulations and thanks all for coming today, and I'll let Zion take it away.
Cool, great. Real quick before we get going, a few pieces of business. One, for people, a lot of folks are connecting on the live stream via YouTube there. If you can't see the screen, which may be hard, if you scroll down on my zionklos.com/defense page, you'll see a PDF version of the slides, so you can follow along with that. For everyone here today and online, this talk isn't your traditional dissertation defense. Instead, my committee was on board with the idea that maybe instead of talking explicitly just about the few chapters that are part of my dissertation, which I've done a lot before and have done a lot of work with and published those things already, so there's not really a concern as much on feedback on those as there is on just kind of my larger perspective on research. And so we decided to structure this talk as a practice job interview talk for a job that is on these little sheets of paper. So if you don't have one, there's a few sitting around the tables. If anyone needs one, grab one here. And basically, what the setup is, and I just put this together this morning quick, is I'm applying for a physical sciences position at the Department of Environmental Studies at the University of, I'm not sure where, but maybe you can write in something that you think is best there. And then a little bit about the job description. And then what I'd like from you is just some feedback from all of you. I'm sure you've seen a lot of job talks before. And you kind of know what those look like. And this is the research talk, and I've already done a teaching talk, so this is more on the research side of it. With that, I think I'll switch into job interview mode here. So thank you all for coming. Okay.
Quick question. Can we dim the lights, or is that going to be a problem with the remote people?
No, that's fine.
Maybe not that one.
How
about that?
There you go.
I think I'm probably in the dark on there, but maybe they can see the slides now. Is there anything in between, or is that the only option?
I think that's our only
That's
option.
the only option.
Aaron, is there a different button?
No, put our flashlights on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we'll do that for everyone here. So sorry folks online, I'm probably a dark blob. You can see me every now and then as I walk through the middle. So, okay. At least you can hear me, which is the most important part, and you can follow along with those PDF slides. Interview mode. Thank you everyone for coming to my teaching talk earlier. I hope you enjoyed the class and got a sense of what my teaching style is about and how I like to go about education. Now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my research. To do a 45-minute talk now, kind of exploring my research background and how I'm kind of building a career based off of that. So the title of the talk today is Hydrology and Climate Change, Lenses by Which to Explore the Interplay of Earth Processes and Society. And presented by myself, Klos. So a little overview, what I want to talk today. Aims for today's talk, discuss hydrologic science in the context of today's world, and a little bit about how I see myself fitting into the larger context of the world of sciences. Then share a bit on my background and goals in context of this larger kind of state of science in the world today. We'll also talk about my epistemological framework, so how I go about doing science, which has quite a bit of diversity within it, as well as my topical framework, which is more focused more on what type of topics I explore within this interdisciplinary framework. Share some specific projects and look at interrelations and details between those projects, and we'll get into some details of that slide by slide. It'll be a chance for you guys to participate as the audience, where you folks will get a chance to choose your own adventure. And then talk finally about how I hope to advance, how I will advance these goals through a career at the University of, yes, that one. So, science of today. Scientific research, a quote that I think it really fits with what, how I've really structured my approach to sciences. As scientists look ahead, interdisciplinary approaches and perspectives will be needed to gain enough understanding of the interactions between water and life and predict the future state of the Earth system. And this is from a report by the National Research Council. And then on the education side of sciences, I think this is a quote that really, I think, fits well how I also frame what I do. Without experiential learning, the dialogue between natural scientists and stakeholders is limited, and people increasingly experience a disconnect from the natural environment. And now as we kind of look forward at combining research with education, which is really my goal in that combination, thinking about what does the future need for the future scientist, particularly within the hydrologic science. I have a few key quotes, again, from the National Research Council, but this is on a report on challenges and opportunities in hydrologic sciences. So those who guide young hydrologic scientists should prepare them for a different type of scientific arena. In addition to traditional activities, education experience should aim to develop intellectual breadth and enrich communication skills. And finally, a T-shaped person is a revolutionary type who drives innovation. They have both areas of deep expertise and a solid breadth of knowledge and interest. They're able to work in an interdisciplinary fashion and see how ideas, sectors, disciplines, and people intersect and connect. And so I think these quotes do a good job of framing a bit of the future world of science. There's obviously a lot more to it than just these quotes, but I think these really help show the framework by which I've kind of steered my own educational experience and research experience and teaching experiences to really help fit these needs and build into that. So my career trajectory, where I've taken my career so far, has been a balance between project-focused and field-based undergraduate education. Second part focused on collaborative interdisciplinary research aimed at scientifically novel yet socially relevant questions in water and climate science. And a combination of both, where I mentor young researchers as they pursue related scientific questions for the first time, and really trying to bring those two together and do the type of education that I love to do and the type of research that I love to do, and make those all in one, as well as outreach, which we'll talk about a bit more. So, a little bit on background of where I have come from before today. My career preparation on the education side, did high school at Conserve School, which is a natural sciences, outdoor environmental focused boarding school in northern Wisconsin. Was brand new when I was going there. Great educational experience to really get into the natural sciences for the first time. Then at Colorado College, that experience at high school really steered me towards Colorado College because of their geology program and the outdoor opportunities afforded with that and at the school. And really got a stellar 4 years of undergraduate experience in geology all over the Western U.S. and all over the world doing my geology degree. And then at the University of Idaho, where I studied hydrology in the environmental sciences program, and then social ecological systems through the interdisciplinary team-based PhD program that I was part of. I'll talk more about. My teaching experience, a lot in high school and college, and in my PhD doing outdoor education and leadership, working with groups in backcountry settings to get them kind of thinking about themselves as individuals and what their life is really all about, which is a lot of what I do at the college level as well, helping people think about where they want to take themselves, take their careers, take their own goals in life. And then, as an undergraduate instructor, through 11 courses across Colorado College, Quest University in Canada, which is a similar liberal arts institution to Colorado College in Colorado, and then at the University of Idaho. As well as a teaching assistant slash, they called it a paraprofessional at Colorado College, where I was a TA for 8 courses there, helping lead and organize field trips and classes across the Western U.S. And then undergraduate research mentor as well for 4 students, and then the official co-advisor for 1. So working with 5 different undergraduates as they went through research experiences, often for their first time, helping them guide them through that process. Research and funding, kind of what's allowed me to do what I've done in my career. Had 2 NSF RAU programs, so research experience for undergraduates with the National Science Foundation at University of Idaho and at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Worked with GNS Science in New Zealand, which is like the USGS of New Zealand, working on active faults for my undergraduate thesis. In college, spending 4 months over there, working with them across the landscape, survey fault hazard. Then we had this PhD funding for NSF IGERT, which is a integrated graduate education and research traineeship, basically an interdisciplinary program, particularly at UI, which was designed as a team-based PhD, where I worked with myself as the kind of water climate specialist, and then a forest ecologist, a cognitive psychologist, and a systems modeler, all were working together to look at climate change in the region and communicate that to the public. And then NSF Graduate Research Fellowship as well, that helped fund the other half of my PhD through the Hydrological Sciences program in the Earth Sciences division of NSF. And then finally, just finishing up what I hope, postdoctoral fellowship at UC Santa Barbara through NSF as well. So research aspects of my career, the goal, what kind of sums it up? As a scientist, my goal is to build adaptive capacity and resilience to the unknown needs of science and society. So, as we move into the future, we're not quite sure where science is going to go, but what are going to be some of the biggest questions out there. We have a good idea now, so what some of the biggest ones are, and I've focused some of my research around that with my skill set in the physical sciences and interdisciplinary aspects of that. And so, but how do we build resilience and adaptive capacity to the unknown? Any ideas out there? Well, one common one from the world of economics or from ecology is diversity, both epistemological and topical. And so really work to diversify a career while also keeping some themes moving forward through my research that allows me to move my research as needed into the future as different topics and different research needs arise. And so a little bit about the epistemological diversity. This is really where I put the PH in my PhD, really getting some of the philosophical context of what I've done and how it all fits together. I like to think about it on these different spectrums of epistemological frameworks. For example, working all the way from individual to small groups to large groups to orchestrating teams of 30 people. All different ways you can go about doing science in terms of how many people are involved in the process. Intra to transdisciplinary, so working on really focused questions within one specific subdiscipline, as well as really broad questions working across disciplines to get at new understanding at the nexus of the disciplines and where they overlap. Reductionist to holistic research, where I am thinking about things, again, at that kind of very specific level, and maybe how different pieces are moving, and trying to really focus in on those versus trying to look at the whole system all at once, and at what point do you zoom in or pull out to create your level of understanding. And then inductive to deductive research, so quite a bit on the observational side, as well as a bit on the experimental side. So how do we actually go about framing that research and testing questions and framing those questions? So applied to basic research, again, usually I like to have a mix of both in every project I do. Basic research is important to advance our greater scientific understanding forward, as well as applied research is important to make science useful to people in the world today to solve the big problems that we have out there. Approaches that I go for are usually a mix between conceptual, so sometimes working purely at a conceptual level using just aspects of logic and reasoning and a lot of literature to back it all up to push ideas forward. Probably a bit more on the physically based side, so using laws of physics to get at understanding how these different systems work, and then supporting that with observational data and then with physically based models. And then statistical as well, so sometimes things are too complex for us to understand through basic laws of physics, such as in ecology or social sciences. And so at that point, if it's too complex, you need to then look at larger data sets and use statistics to try to pull out meaning from what you can't necessarily associate with directly with fundamental laws. And finally, find a broad scale, both temporally and spatially, scales at which I look at those research questions. And then I think finally the risk versus gains. And this is really kind of how, starting off my research career, starting with very low risk research that pretty likely you'll do the work and you'll have a finding that's significant enough that you can put that forward, but maybe not the most revealing finding in terms of blowing everyone's minds in terms of what's going on. But low risk type research, whereas I move forward trying for more higher risk research where you're not quite sure if that project or data is going to pan out, but if it does, you're going to have a much larger amount of understanding created from it, and so kind of balancing those in each of my projects. And if you can get a win-win where you have a low risk, high gain, those are the best ones to shoot for, obviously. And now on topical diversity, I mentioned that T-shaped approach earlier on about creating both depth and breadth of understanding. And so my depth is really in water, particularly the physical aspects of water, both quantity and timing of flow in the atmosphere, surface, subsurface. And then the breadth really comes from kind of three main disciplines or fields outside of that, from geology, from ecology, and from the social sciences, both sociology and psychology as well. And then all of these on my T has a little extra stack on the top because not only do I look at interrelationships between these different disciplines, but I also enjoy focusing on questions in context of climate change, both using past climate and data sets from that, as well as making projections into the future using climate models to think about where our future climate is going, and not just the climate, but how these systems are then going to respond and move into the future. And I really want to emphasize that, yeah, there's a lot of different disciplines, a lot of things going on, but the questions I love focusing on, and I love to work with students to create, is how do we now take strong understanding in all of these disciplines and look at overlaps where maybe we don't have a lot of understanding yet because people haven't been able to bridge those areas. So if we can find research questions that bridge those disciplines and find novel questions at that intersection, that's really where I aim a lot of my research. And so I really have gotten really good at myself and working with other students of mine to really get into new subfields they have never explored before, but relate to the subfield that they have their base of understanding in, and just trying to figure out, okay, where are these exciting questions? If you can do that with other people in a team-based setting, then you have all these strengths coming together. You're able to find those really novel questions at the intersection of those disciplines. So, sit back, get ready. We're going to put essentially a little bit of background on all the work I've done in context of one figure. So we'll get a little filled up at the end, but we're going to walk through it slowly. I'm going to acknowledge that now. So I like this coupled human-natural systems approach to thinking about both kind of this physical Earth system on the left, particularly in the context of hydrology. You have your classic hydrologic cycle with a few other aspects of geology and ecology tied into that. And then on the right side of this diagram, we see a cycle where we move from our biophysical understanding of the system to individual understanding. So kind of psychology, cognitive approaches to transferring information, and then information transfer from the individual to the group, and then from the group in terms of policy and management decisions, then moving back to how that influences the biophysical system. And so that's kind of the larger context in which all of my projects operate. And so we're going to kind of throw all those out there, and then we're going to make some sense of that after I put them all on the table. So just a really brief introduction to the work I've done in my career. There'll be projects, I'm not going to talk too much about the teaching ones, but I'll show them on there in context. Talk a lot about the research and the outreach, so it's not coming through too well, but outreach in yellow there. So we have kind of first project I want to emphasize on the top of this hydrologic cycle, looking at rain-snow shifts, publishing a paper there in Geophysical Research Letters, talking about how climate change influences where rain versus snow is coming down across the landscape, which we'll talk about more shortly, as well as two other manuscripts that are both in prep right now. One pretty close, one a little farther to go, that look at taking that kind of understanding of rain versus snow systems, understanding what that means for hydrology on the ground in terms of when we're going to have flows, and what that's going to look like in terms of creating different flow regimes and how those move and change through time and through space as you shift rain and snow. As well, postdoctoral research focusing on both intensified precipitation, so not as much the phase, but how much is coming down and how fast, as well as fire, to get at what are our risks of erosion in headwater systems, and then how does that loss of sediment influence then the ability to store water in those systems and provide water, particularly during the dry season, and generate flow. Project near submission as well, looking at clear cut versus partially cut versus uncut forests and how that relates to stream flow, particularly heating regimes. And project in review with Journal of Hydrology, looking at juniper systems, but particularly this kind of discontinuous forests in semi-arid environments, how different trees respond to subsurface moisture. So kind of tying surface ecohydrology with deep subsurface geophysics to look at water being pulled from tens of meters down. McLaughlin et al. Paper, also near submission, kind of putting all this upslope understanding together, looking at hydrologic microrefugia and which areas of the landscape are going to be more resilient to climate change in terms of preserving that water on the system into the future. Paper published 2012, where we did work in cobblebed rivers, now moving down this hydrologic system into larger order streams, and how the type of river system influences how much surface water versus groundwater exchange there is, and really advancing kind of basic understanding of surface water groundwater exchange, published in Hydrologic Processes. And a paper published on a similar topic in ecohydrology, looking at how surface water groundwater exchange looks in relation to population distributions of endangered mussel species. So kind of taking a little bit more of a biological approach to understanding the influence of the physical system. And finally, I know this goes back a ways, and it actually from high school, but in high school we did a 2-year thesis project to finish off our educational degrees. So I spent 2 years collecting data, doing flow modeling for groundwater, and understanding surface water and groundwater exchange between lakes and groundwater systems in northern Wisconsin. And I just like to put this up there. It's a good project. I learned a lot from it and advanced a little bit of understanding, but just to show that I've really been thinking about these questions for a long time, and have been excited about science for a long time in my life. So it's fun to take it this far. Now looking at lake systems in relation to estuary systems in coastal areas through Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and how those change through time related to climate change and coastal erosion. And then kind of working not only in temperate systems, which is what all these other projects are in, but then expanding now into tropical systems, and was lucky enough to do this interdisciplinary PhD at the University of Idaho, where it was not only teams based in Idaho, but teams based down in Costa Rica in similar diversity of ecological systems. So we'll work with some of those teams to look at similar questions in ecohydrology within tropical rainforest, which I'll get at some details of shortly. Another paper purely on the meta-analysis and modeling side, looking at across these broad climate spectrums, what is our balance of water coming in and water coming out, and how does that relate to how much storage we have in those systems, and how those would respond to climate change in the future. My undergraduate thesis, working on active faults, not quite as related to the rest of the hydrologic system, but a good context as I kind of teach about physical sciences, have a good breadth of understanding in terms of some of the more hard rock geology type world there, as well as some work from my PhD that does actually get at the differences in lithology between a granite system and a basalt system, and how that relates to development of soils and saprolite in the subsurface, and kind of getting at questions of hill slope evolution and co-evolution between the subsurface and the plants and climate on the surface. Similar questions as well, working with a much broader team of hydrologists and geomorphologists across the world, doing a large review paper on the same topic. Have now moving as we take the biophysical system and move now into the social sciences side of this this larger coupled human natural system. Spearheaded a project which I'll talk about more, looking at translating this information and summarizing it for the state of Idaho, as well then using a summary of climate change information that we published in Weather, Climate, and Society to then merge with a series of workshops that we did on regional climate change science and adaptation in Idaho and Montana, working with communities across the region, and not only providing climate science information, but also evaluating how effective we were at providing that information to then help other scientists who are doing similar things across the country and across the world be more effective in communicating climate science. So both a cognitive psychology paper and more of a policy and management focused paper that used both pre and post interviews and surveys to evaluate which aspects of the workshop were more or less effective and why. As well, some other projects kind of at this interface between the individual and the group, looking at urban ecology and how do we transfer knowledge through not just traditional logical framework, but also thinking about more effective transfer of knowledge through emotional response. Paper I was involved in bioscience, where we kind of summarized this disconnect often between the biophysical system and the social and governance system, and how we often make good policy decisions that don't really reflect the biophysical system, and there's often a spatial disconnect between those two. Is what that paper focused on, particularly within tropical systems. And finally, the last research on the board, 2 manuscripts, one published in Integrative Pathways, an interdisciplinary journal, and one in Bioscience, focused on how do we go about understanding this whole system all as one. And these are both pedagogical papers about my PhD experience through the larger integrated social ecological systems resilience project we had over the 4 or 5 years, and what was the pedagogical models we used, and how did we advance those through trying to understand this whole system as a whole. And then a couple other outreach projects, one around working with teachers in schools, doing similar types of climate change outreach, as well climate change outreach designed for public audiences as opposed to particular land managers, which is what the main workshops were focused on. So a lot of presentations with those, and then one quite large climate change outreach project focused on coastal systems and sea level rise called Climate Odyssey, where my wife as an environmental artist and myself as climate scientist paired up. We started an old wind sailboat and sailed essentially from Wisconsin down to the tropics, focusing on the eastern seaboard of the U.S., using art as a way to engage people first around climate change, and then after you have that affective engagement or that emotional engagement, then bringing in the cognitive pieces and tying those together very aesthetically. And then finally, I'll just pop up my classes on there. Just you guys got to enjoy one of my classes in the talk, but just the other types of classes I've taught. Working again at this art science nexus, teaching with my wife in visual environmental communication, using art science and GIS all together. Several classes in hydrology, physical geology, Earth's carbon and climate cycle, social ecological systems, focused on kind of a place-based understanding of these systems through a backcountry course where we rafted the Green River for 4 weeks and explored the system as we went. And then doing conservation social sciences, a co-instructor for the field studies program. We're going out for several weeks in the summer to explore different policy and management applications within public lands in the western US. And then instructor for education courses in geosciences designed for individual students. As they help me teach other courses, I could then give them pedagogical feedback and they can reflect on their pedagogy as well as essentially being a TA. And then finally, a few of the courses that I was a TA in that are applicable within the physical sciences. So hydrothermal placement, sedimentation and stratigraphy, and mineralogy and metrology. And with that, if you want even more information, all of these are highlighted and organized in a lot more detail on my website at zionklos.com. So that was a lot. It's kind of all over the place, but it had a theme going in terms of how it all fit together. And I really want to emphasize now more on the epistemological side. How do I decide which research projects I'm able to work on and which ones I'm not able to work on? And they kind of all fit within 3 themes. Essentially are the skill set that I have from more of a philosophical side of how I go about doing research. One of the 3 main themes is process understanding through field-based observation and physically based modeling. So really using laws of physics to make sense of observations we see in the field and to make sense of those same observations in the lab on the computer, so that we can combine those to kind of triangulate on understanding of these physical systems and how processes actually operate in advanced process understanding. I'll go show one example of that so you can get a little sense of what that's about from a Journal of Hydrology paper of mine. Then I'll have a second theme, which is theoretical advancement through data synthesis and meta-analysis. So using large data sets, kind of 4th paradigm of science approach to going about science to then create new understanding of how these systems are operating using these large data sets and doing things with statistics and with physically based downscaling to then create new understanding of those systems. We have one paper I'll highlight with that from Geophysical Research Letters. And then finally, the last theme is understanding the role of science in society. I admit that's a pretty broad theme, but I'm usually not the primary in these type of projects. I do love working on this type of stuff, but I also like working with people who are specialists in the social sciences and kind of bringing my expertise in water and climate to the table. And so I'll give an example where I did actually spearhead a project on this published in an interdisciplinary journal from the American Meteorological Society. And then I'll talk about one of my major outreach projects, which is this Northern Rockies IGRT team outreach, creating these multi-scale climate change science workshops that we did across communities in Idaho and Montana. So, with that, we have our big system again, but I'm just going to highlight these 4 that I'm going to get into there now and where those fit. So first we'll do physically based approach. Then we'll do meta-analysis, and then we'll look at kind of the overlap of science and society. So, this manuscript is titled Through-Fall Heterogeneity in Tropical Forested Landscapes as a Focal Mechanism for Deep Percolation. Okay, it's a cool title, great for Journal of Hydrology. Maybe that's great for all of you. Don't know what all those words mean. Quick explanation. Basically, the question was, okay, so we have evenly distributed precip coming down on top of a forest. We now have a forest that's going to focus that precip in some places and actually have more precip hitting the ground than would otherwise fall if evenly distributed. We have other places that are drier. And this precip coming through is called throughfall, what makes it down to the forest floor. And then at the forest floor, how much is making it actually down past the root zone, because a lot of it just makes it down to the root zone, gets then reabsorbed by the roots between the rainstorms, which happen pretty much every day, or a couple times a day, as 2 months of field work showed, and then makes its way back up, or does it actually make it down? If it can make it down past that root zone, and these root zones are kind of sub 1 meter, pretty shallow in these tropical systems I was working in, it can then make it into deep groundwater. And groundwater is actually important because despite raining a lot, it doesn't rain all the year. There are dry periods within the year, and that there is times a year where people are dependent on surface water that's fed by these groundwater systems that they hope will persist through those dry periods. So the methods we employed, we had through-fall measurements, so actually how much is making it through these forest canopies, soil moisture profiles, going out, augering down up to 3 meters at a time by hand in the tropical clays. Lots of fun when it's 100 degrees and 100% humidity and everything around you is moving and trying to bite you. And then worked in both Costa Rican primary and secondary forests. So trying to understand how old growth forests work and how secondary forests that have been regrown, how those maybe operate differently. And then finally using physically based modeling to not only show, to create an understanding through our observations, but also show using just laws of physics, can we explain what we saw. This is the research team, myself and fellow teammates down in Costa Rica. I'm the large white guy on the left who managed to get every single spider web white right in the face, as you can see why. And so you're hiking around. So a little allusion to some of the hydrous 3D modeling that I was doing to actually get at partially unsaturated flow in the subsurface in relation to these heterogeneous inputs, as well as kind of the main summary figure from the field data set. What this graph is showing here on the x-axis, you have plot normalized soil water content in percent. So what it means by plot normalized is it's soil water content, so how wet or dry it is, but based on one individual plot, is it wetter or drier than the average, and compared to all the other plots, is there more variance or is there less variance? So each of these blue dots is paired with a red dot on the other side to show you the variance of how wet or dry each plot is. And then the mean of the wettest and driest spots for each plot are in those larger dots there. And you can see, and this is the main takeaway from this, is we have the root zone, which is in the top about 80 centimeters of the subsurface. As you go down in depth, here's centimeters on the y-axis. As you move down, you can see that there is quite a bit of overlap between the red and the blue dots, showing that the places that have the most throughfall on the surface and the places that have the least throughfall on the surface don't show a lot of difference in the subsurface in terms of how much water is down there in that root zone, and that's what we'd expect if the roots are redistributing the water during those intermittent periods between the storms when I'm actually out there measuring, because it's kind of hard to measure during the storm because your little hole fills full of water instantly. But the really exciting part and why we're able to get published in Journal of Hydrology is then all of a sudden below a meter of depth we see this stark contrast in the wettest throughfall sites are now the wettest spots, and the driest throughfall sites are now the driest spots in those plots. And that continues down, but then eventually homogenizes again at depth. And through field data and then modeling to explain what's going on, we're actually able to show that this is the case, that focused throughfall does redistribute by the roots, and then, oops, I got too close, does redistribute in the roots, but then adds a focused input in the subsurface that eventually homogenizes as everything starts to flow down slope. And people had hypothesized that this existed before and had modeled it and showed that if it does exist, it means there's potentially 3 times more water than you'd expect making it into the subsurface, but no one had actually shown it in the field as actual observational data. So that's what we were able to do. Second project, now this is looking at that kind of meta-analysis spectrum, fourth paradigm of type science that I work in. This is a publication in Geophysical Research Letters in entitled Extent of the Rain-Snow Transition in the Western U.S. Under Historic and Projected Climate. A little bit easier to understand title there, but really looking at how rain regimes and snow regimes exist today in the Western U.S. and how those will shift into the future. Essentially, this is the main figure. This figure has been passed around a lot of places, been shown in a lot of articles in magazines and stuff. Probably the biggest highlight was with Wired magazine picked it up and did an article looking at this figure in the paper, but really showing that here in the south, in the west of the western U.S., we have blue, which is rain-dominated zone of precip for the winter months. So in wintertime, you're not going to get snow anyways, it's going to be rain. Now in the winter, everything that's in white and gray is snow-dominated, saying that those are areas like Idaho, for example, that's all snow-dominated in the winter. And then we have pink to red is that rain-snow transition zone where you have a mix of rain and snow coming in during the winter months. And then the scientifically exciting and very scary part is now everything in light gray there is areas that used to be snow-dominated, but now by mid-century are going to be in that rain-snow mix or all-rain zone. So really taking away a lot of that snowpack and trying to putting rain into that system instead during the winter months. This is the main summary figure from the paper showing the percent of the western U.S. within a snowfall regime on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis looking at months of October, November, December, January through May. Particularly looking at mid-winter months, you can see how much of the western U.S. Historically in the dark gray bar, which is quite a bit higher than the light gray bar, historically at about 55% of the western U.S. was snow-dominated. By mid-century, we're seeing that go down to more about like 20 or 25% of the western U.S. So pretty large drop in the amount of snow in the system. And so has a lot of implications for water resource management, for ecological systems, and for recreation and all the other reasons that we love having snow in our landscape. And this is a little example of that same data set, but how I do a lot of outreach work, really trying to make it a lot easier for the public to visualize. So this is the Bitterroot Valley, looking up at Missoula. In red, we see the historic rain-snow transition zone, and then on either side, we see the snow-dominated areas that are currently clear. Now we're seeing where that rain-snow transition zone moves by mid-century. You see that really moving up the valley, and a lot less of your landscape is snow-dominated. And then using ArcGlobe and kind of being able to project these GIS layers in 3D and kind of fly around the landscape. I'm not going to go through all of this because it kind of goes all over the Montana and Idaho region, looking at different areas. But you kind of get the sense of how you, as an audience member, if you have no familiarity with science, but you can still kind of make sense of the landscape that you exist on and how that's going to shift through time. Okay, so now I'll focus on that last section, which is indicators of climate change, a project called Indicators of Climate Change in Idaho, an assessment framework for coupling biophysical change and social perception. This is published in Weather, Climate, and Society, the journal American Meteorological Society. And what we did here is, you can see my name at the top there with 29 other folks along. It was a long time spent organizing a big group of people to get at what are the changes from climate change we see in Idaho, and how do we best communicate those to people and summarize those based on what people need. So a bit of social science and biophysical science together, presented as well through an easy to read website that was rewritten with the English department at the University of Idaho. And what an indicator is either a direct measure of climate, either air temp or precip on the left side there. And then we have a variable partially influenced by climate, can still be an indicator, but say, for example, fire disturbance could be influenced by a lot of other things besides just climate change directly. And so we summarized a lot of these different data sets from the state of Idaho, looking at time series graphs, so time on the X, and then this is say a departure from a mean in terms of days of the growing season length. So is the growing season like shorter or is it longer? You see through time that it's getting longer as things warm up, as well as looking at just the state of Idaho and stream flow in the state, looking through time, looking at height of stream flow in terms of total discharge from these different water systems, and seeing that decrease through time. And so that information was then taken to create these adaptation workshops, where I worked with my interdisciplinary team of cognitive psychologist, forest ecologist, climate and water physical scientist, and forest modeler, and actually present this type of information on all different types of scales, and do pre and post interviews and surveys to evaluate how effective were we at bridging the academic world, which we were kind of operating in, with the management world. So both different worlds of science, but they use science in very different ways, and so making sure that we can translate between those two. And in these workshops, essentially we're evaluating changes in knowledge, attitude, and intention to use this science, and we both had expert opinion and kind of testimony from us as well, kind of teaching people the basics of climate science, as well as showing very regional and local information that's really relevant to the audience there, doing a bunch of modeling, but between all these different sections over the whole day, having people break out again and again into smaller groups and discuss what aspects of what they just saw were more or less useful and why, and then trying to summarize all that information so that other scientists out there who are trying to bridge this management and academic world can be more effective at doing it. So, we're running out a little bit of time here, so I was going to give you a chance to choose your own adventure as well. But for the sake of time, I'll just allude that we have some few more of these preps. So during the question and answer section, if there's any of these other highlighted projects you'd like to know anything more about, we can look at a quick slide or two from those. And then to wrap things up, I just want to kind of put my framework that I use for approaching this science and kind of what I've learned from my years of experience and what I hope to cultivate within students of my own into the future. So I really, as you can see, try to work between education, research, and outreach, particularly trying to find projects that do combinations of both, or in the best, all three. And that's really where the goal is. And then it's at that goal, it's now looking at the overlap of both my kind of scientific interest and social relevance. And this is kind of getting at that NSF theme of intellectual merit and broader impact. What I see is really important. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that's the framework I really try to help my students develop within themselves through self-authorship and kind of taking some ideas that I can provide to them, but really internally creating their own ways of thinking and thinking about why it is they do the things they do and how they can take their goals and career potentially forward with that. And so this overlap set on the left is academic interest, helping students figure out both their individual motivations, curiosity, scientific, so what kinds of science are more or less interesting, and then experiential. So a lot about, for me, doing science is I love being outside and I love working with people. And so those experiences help dictate a lot of what type of science I choose to work on. And then on the other side, social relevance, thinking about, and help students thinking about what are their motivations for what makes them excited to be doing the science from kind of a broader perspective side. Is it really about the moral aspects, feeling that they need to, certain groups need to be helped or are marginalized and need information to help that, as well as altruistic, trying to do something more than just yourself, and often the application side of it too. How can I take this science forward to say, look at a future career in a certain job field, or within who's going to actually use it on the ground. Maybe I'd like to work with that kind of agency or NGO or something like that. And at that merger, then hopefully maybe creating some life goals. Not necessarily saying students are going to figure out a career in their undergraduate, but are going to have some ideas of how they can take that forward and what things they can do now to help better prepare them for what they may or may not want to do into the future, and kind of essentially figure that out. So with the last slide here, say the fundamental goal for my life and really just who I am in try to sum it up into one academic sounding, somewhat convoluted statement, is basically I aim to maximize happiness individually to globally through education and science that aids society in the pursuit of a better future. And to achieve this, I will continue to be resilient, adaptive, and effective as a teacher and scientist into an unknown future. And that's who I am and what I work to do. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Tim Link, for continuous enthusiastic encouragement and a lot of open-mindedness over the last 6 years doing my PhD. I'm going to step out of my interview role now. I'd like to thank my other faculty members, my committee, and a whole host of other great folks across the university and a lot of other universities that I've worked with and have gotten a lot of feedback from over the years. Fellow students, my teammates, office mates, folks that we've worked on a lot of different questions, a lot of different projects, and a lot of different people that had a lot of fun along the way, and a lot of beer. And finally, NSF, NASA Joint Fire Sciences, and UI for financial support through this whole process. And pending the committee, I say let's party. So if you are around this evening, stop on by 409 Lewis Street at 7 p.m. Bring something to drink or something to grill or eat on the side, and we'll do a little barbecue potluck. So with that, yeah. I guess time for some questions. Yeah.
So one thing that really struck me in your initial discussion of your trajectory through all of these different pursuits is how you find the most interesting and dynamic research questions at the interface between disciplines. And I'm curious about your process about developing those types of questions. How do you feel out where those gaps are when you are starting to look at multiple disciplines within a single set of research questions? And if you could just speak on what that process has been like for you.
Yeah. Essentially in terms of starting the process of the first
just
steps.
how do you approach something of that scale?
Yeah. I'd say for me it's about interacting with others who have more specialty in an area, but oftentimes we each have really specific deep understanding in just subfields of the discipline that we represent. So I may be talking with an ecologist and we'll think about some water ecology overlap, but we're both now thinking about subfields within hydrology and ecology, and often will come up, it's like, I wonder how that works, or I wonder how this system, or here's a big problem out there, but we don't each really know the specifics necessarily as well, because we all have our different subfields we publish stuff in that we maybe have really specific understanding. But once you realize there may be some gaps, then what I do and what I've gotten really good at and helping students do is, okay, now how do we get out? I do a whole like 3 days of this and a lot of the courses I teach. Okay, how do you take some idea you now have, particularly an interdisciplinary idea, and get into the literature on it? So getting really good with Google Scholar, getting really good with really quickly and efficiently going through manuscripts and abstracts and titles to pull out what is the current state of knowledge within that subfield, and how does that relate to the subfield within that other discipline, or often if there are a few papers that are at the nexus already, and then within a few days being able to sort through all that and figure out, okay, what questions have been solved and what questions are still out there, and then at that point deciding, okay, those are the questions that are left. Maybe they've already solved the question we had in the first place, or they haven't, and that's a novel place to go forward. But then it's also deciding, okay, now the practicality and logistics of it. Do we have the funding to do it? Am I going to do it individually because maybe this other person thought it was cool, but they don't have time for it, which is often the case. And I'm often on the other side of the spectrum too. Like here's some cool ideas, but I don't have time to work on that one, kind of thing. And then so you figure out your team, figure out your approach, and then that's essentially how you move forward step by step. So I really love spending time. I'll take an afternoon just to jump in on an idea online and see where things are at, and I've gotten really good at going into whole new subfields, whole new disciplines, and pulling out the literature on that. And through the interdisciplinary PhD, I have enough of a broad understanding that I can make sense of the technical information within a lot of these disciplines that I work within. So yeah, I guess that's how I go about doing it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to add for folks looking online there at the stream. I want to say there's a comments bar on the right side, so if you have questions you'd like asked through the group, put them on there. If I don't have time to get to them now, I'll try to put some responses on there later on. Actually, if one of you guys can pull up that YouTube page on zionklos.com/defense, just so we can see it. Oh, yeah. Oh, you're not online. Okay, I'll grab
Just
it.
have your pieces.
Yeah, one thing I didn't quite think about. I'll pull it up on my phone, thankfully.
Hard to get that. What is it again?
Oh yeah, you got okay, great.
I had a tap there.
We got Jim as the moderator, so zionklos.com/defense, and then you'll see on there a YouTube link which everyone's watching along with. And so if there's some questions on there, bring them up. Yeah, some more questions for here.
Hey, Zion, thank you. And I appreciate your approach to your job talk. And I have a question about the slide where you talk about guiding students' self-authorship.
Yeah.
And I may have missed it, but can you, when you talk about self-authorship, do you mean in a metaphorical sense in terms of how students write their own career or define their own place? Or do you talk more about the actual literal sense of students writing?
It's the first one. So self-authorship, I alluded to it really briefly, but didn't have time to get into it. It's a pedagogical approach that's common in the interdisciplinary literature, particularly at the undergraduate level, of how students not only are advancing their topical understanding or maybe a philosophical understanding of how they're going about the actual science or scholarship, whatever the field is outside of the sciences as well. But then a metacognitive part, which is the self-authorship. It's really about how do we take what I'm learning in the classroom and then think about what it is I actually want to be learning, what it is I want to be doing with that knowledge, how I want to take that knowledge moving forward, and what parts of it are more or less exciting if I actually start thinking about what my future life could look like. Because by starting to create, and it kind of alludes to that second definition you have, it's called self-authorship. It's about creating your own narrative of who you are and starting to write a little bit of a preamble where maybe you could be, acknowledging that could totally change and likely always does change, but if you don't even think about it, then you're not going to have any chance at figuring out if that's the right path for you or not. So it's all about helping students start thinking about the process and thinking about where they could go so that they have a chance to then try out a few different options, maybe cross some things off the list or keep on moving forward with certain pathways that they could take their life.
Yeah, just a comment on that. I think that's really powerful, particularly for students to be aware of that process, particularly as students think about learning, going from a passive mode into more of an active mode of taking the information that they may be ingesting, or even with hands-on projects, thinking then how can they move that forward as their own, taking ownership of it.
Yeah.
That could be
Yeah, it's really powerful, and it's something that particularly in the interdisciplinary science programs that are out there in different universities and some colleges are doing, because unlike a traditional degree program, a student doesn't have a set of classes already predetermined. They have to create that for themselves, and in order to do that effectively, they have to have a better understanding of where they want to go with it. And so they've realized that that's a big gap in the sense like this 60s or 70s when a lot of these programs got going. There's been a lot of work refining, and so every year I go to the Association for Interdisciplinary Studies conference, which is all about, I talk about it at the graduate level, but a lot of it's at the undergraduate level. How do we make these programs more effective in helping students move forward? But it can apply to not just interdisciplinary students, to any student out there, any individual. It's all about how do we narrate our lives a little bit more so we can get the most out of our educational experience. Yeah. Cool. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm just glad to see you doing a lot of outreach, community-based education and teaching, and I'd like to know more about how you did that, and maybe this isn't the venue for that, but how you approached that and how it was received, and any thoughts on what I can pass on to my fellow extension educators, because that's kind of what we do, our bread and butter.
Yeah, I think the two biggest takeaways I've gotten from outreach is know your audience, because each piece of outreach I do has the same core pieces, but they're always tailored in a different way depending on who I'm talking to. Is it a group of more progressive people from the Boise public at the library who are concerned about climate change in the state, or is it a group of logger contractors in Lewiston that were kind of surprised that they were going to be learning about climate change, but all of a sudden realize the value in it once you make it applicable to things that they care about day to day. So, yeah, so the audience is a big one, and then starting off the talk, before you, well, I guess there's 3 parts, one specific to climate change. The second one is before you start, or when you start the talk, giving 5 minutes at the beginning just to build some trust with your audience. Talk about who you are, why you're there. You're not there with any hidden agenda. You're just trying to help people understand how their system works and so they can better prepare, say, for the future, or better make decisions based on better understanding of the science. Like, that's what my role is. And just talking a little bit about your past. And like, you know, I have a variety of backgrounds, from growing up on a farm in Wisconsin to living on a boat to going all across the country for different types of schooling, and taking different parts of my life and highlighting those so I can connect with my audience appropriately. And then the last part, specific to climate change, that I think is really important for anyone trying to do that type of work, is from the public really working with historical data first, and then bringing in any future modeling later on. Because if you start with modeling data, people get really skeptical really fast, but you can ease them into it by showing, oh, these things are kind of already changing. Now here's some really detailed information about where our future is going. So that's a little takeaway I got from here. But I guess those are the biggest ones they have. Those first 2 especially are what I apply to all my outreach. Yeah, cool.
Great. Well, we're actually a little over time. But if anybody has questions for Zion, he's pretty easy to find because ZionKlos.com, even though he's not a commercial entity, is the place you can find all the information and links to where to get on Zion.
I thought it'd be a little nicer than being an organization, but I don't know. It's hard to say. I'd like to really thank you guys for any feedback you've given too. I really appreciate that. I know it's not the traditional way of doing it, but feel free to take more cookies and coffee on your way out. And if you could just pile up those feedback cards and just put them on the table somewhere, and I'll go grab those. As well as online, if people have feedback, there's that prompt at the bottom of the defense page. Feel free to email me any ideas that you have. So thank you very much for joining online. Sorry it's a little bit dark, but I hope it worked out.
All right. Just add, there will be a party, whether we're celebrating Zion's successes or drowning in sorrows.
There we go. Oh, and then Mark and Michael, I'm going to Skype you in, so just give me a call on Skype here in like 2 minutes. There you go.